the first test I want to look at is their knowledge of what people are called. People are called different things in different places. Certain places you might get called Seamus, another place you might get called Ahmed. There are more places, with lots of different names. In Britain, there are slightly different patterns of names from what we have over here. Over here, as I understand it, there are quite a few Michaels in a certain generation. We've got any Mikes out there? Michaels? Anyone? Yeah. Okay, thank you. You're about the right age. Sorry. And then if you go back about 40 years, there are very few Jacobs in the whole of the US. And then they're really on the rise. We've got any Jakes out there, Jacobs? Got a few? Raise hands? Okay, good. So there are sort of patterns that occur in names, and those are the sorts of things that we can study for the time of the Gospels. You can actually look at the names that people are given on bone boxes, or in the Writer Josephus, or in the Dead Sea Scrolls, or in historical records at the time, and you can make a database of all the names people had. Well, that sounds really, really boring, doesn't it? That's a sort of boring thing people like me get involved in, but actually there was someone else who did the really boring groundwork, so that's okay, I just cherry pick on the top. And what you can find out is some very interesting patterns. When you look at the names of Jewish men inside the Gospels, you find they're really pretty similar to Jewish men outside the Gospels, and these are Jewish men from the land of Israel and Palestine. So what I mean by that is outside the Gospels, the top two names are Simon's name number 1 and Joseph, his name number 2. Those are the same names in the same order inside the Gospels. So if I look at the names of what people are called in the time and place, I find a great correlation. About 16% of men outside the Gospels with those two names, about 18% inside the Gospels. Let's go to a bigger data sample and say, let's look at the top 9 men's names. I find the top 9 men's names for Jewish men in Israel, Palestine, about 41% have those names. Inside the Gospels, it's about 40%. That's the Gospels and Acts. So that's a pattern that's showing up over 5 different books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. It's also showing up over 4 different writers. It shows up roughly for them individually and for them as a whole. For women's names, there's a similar thing. The most important woman's name outside the New Testament for a Jewish woman from that land is Mary. It's also the most popular name inside the Gospels. Now, there's a little bit less imagination about what's called women, I'm afraid. So it's about 29% of women got the top 2 names, Mary or Salome, outside the Gospels, and inside it's about 39%. And about half of women had the top 9 names outside the Gospels, about 61% inside the Gospels. You can see there's a pretty good correlation. And if we look at, say, the ranks of names as they are in Israel, we find that we'd have very different ranks of names if we went for Jews from another land. If we go to Jews for another land, and there were many, many Jews in Egypt, particularly in the city of Alexandria, we find a very different sequence of names. So we take a name like Sabbathaius. Now, does anyone here know anyone called Sabbathaius? Why not? Because the Gospels weren't written about Jewish men in Egypt. If they had been, it would probably become a common name, and there'd probably be some people called Josephus and Pappus and Ptolemaeus here. But because they were written about Jewish men in Israel, they didn't have that lot of names. And we can see that there are different ranks for those names. So Simon, which was a very popular name inside Israel, was not a popular name outside. We can also say that there's another thing about names. I mean, do any of you ever struggle to remember names? Yeah? Bit of honesty out there. A few people struggle to remember names. Quite a few honest people here in the middle. So what we find is names are really hard to remember. You know why names are hard to remember? Because they're so completely random. They're completely arbitrary. There's no logical reason why someone has a name. Sometimes there are even logical reasons why they should not have that name, but that was an issue for their parents. The point is, there's just this label you put on someone. And so often you're in a social situation and you know that person, you know what course they're studying, you know what car they drive, you know where they came from, you know the last conversation you had with them. You just can't remember that little piece of information you need, apparently, to talk to them politely. You know, we've got this weird social convention that we like to name people when they already know their name, you know, in the first sentence, and if you don't name them, they feel insulted or something. Maybe we should abolish that, but the point, it can be an embarrassing convention, can't it, really? But we have that issue that often we know tons of things about people, we just can't remember their name. We know it, we just, struggle to remember it. And that's also because we remember stories very easily and names are very hard. So we can watch a film and we can remember the story, we can even remember what the minor characters did, and sometimes while we remember what the minor characters did, we've forgotten the names of the major characters. It's weird, but that's because stories are easy to remember and names are hard to remember. So think about it. If the Gospels have correctly got the sort of detail that's the hard thing to remember, isn't there every reason to think they can get the other stuff right? But you can add a little more detail here. You see, if there are lots of people called Simon, you call out Simon, and of course lots of people turn their head. And that means you need to do what Wikipedia calls disambiguation. You come across that? Have any of you ever used Wikipedia? Of course not for your assignments, but the point is that disambiguation is what they do. You have two of Jesus' 12 disciples called Simon. One is Simon with the extra bit Peter or Cephas. The other is Simon with the extra bit the Canaanite or the Zealot, which just mean the same thing. Then you have Jesus going to have a meal with a person called Simon the leper, who doesn't seem to be a leper at the time. At least people aren't scared of catching leprosy. Maybe it's Jesus had healed him. But the point is he's given that extra bit of name to disambiguate him. In the book of Acts, Simon Peter goes to stay with Simon the tanner or the leather worker, who carries Jesus' cross, Simon of Cyrene. Who goes to the tomb? Mary Magdalene. You hear about Mary, the mother of James and Joseph. You can disambiguate in all sorts of ways. Job, parents' names, where they come from, lots of ways like that. And what you find is this disambiguation is occurring with all of the most popular names and not with the less popular names. So it's exactly the sort of pattern you would get if the stories really do come from that land, and if they came from elsewhere, you wouldn't bother to disambiguate because there would be fewer Simons, there would be fewer Marys. So when Romans mentions a Mary in chapter 16, because it's writing to Rome, you don't need to disambiguate. It makes sense. But when you're in the Gospels, you do. We can also say, compare what we have in the four Gospels with what we have in apocryphal Gospels, and you'll see that they don't do so well. The Gospel of Thomas that many people have heard about has as its main character a man called Didymus Judas Thomas. Well, you know what that means? It means twin Judas twin, which is not a very likely name for the time and place. We can then take the Gospel of Mary. Well, the funny thing about the Gospel of Mary is we don't have a clue which Mary this was, even though it's a really common name. I mean, which Mary is this supposed to be? Mary of Bethany? You know, is it Mary Magdalene? Mary, the mother of Jesus? Who knows? It doesn't even have the name Jesus, it just calls him the Savior. And then my favorite one is the Gospel of Judas. You know, where Judas is the good guy? Oh, and by the way, he wrote it just before he hanged himself. He didn't have very long to write it. That's why it's like it is. There are only two names that are appropriate for the land. One is the name Judas, and the other is the name Jesus, and the rest are lots of figures from outer space. Barbelo. I like Barbelo. So in other words, knowledge of time and space is not very good in those apocryphal Gospels, but it's very good in the four Gospels. Now you can look at, say, the names you get in Matthew. John is a very common name. And we can see that in some of the... No, I've got the wrong slide. So let's go to this one. I didn't have to be that honest then, did I? Here we have a list of the 12 disciples in Matthew. I have put in brackets whenever the name is in the top 99 names for Israel-Palestine. And what we see is there's a correlation between whether there's a disambiguator and how popular a name is. So we take this name... The first, most popular one here, Simon, ranked number 1 with a disambiguator. Andrew, not in the top 99, but he's explained with relation to his brother. James, high-ranking disambiguator, and John, his brother. Then we have 2 low-ranking names without disambiguators. One name which is off the chart without a disambiguator, a high-ranking name with a disambiguator, a high-ranking name with a disambiguator, a low-ranking name without a disambiguator, a high-ranking name with a disambiguator, and a high-ranking name with a disambiguator. In other words, there's a correlation between whether there's a disambiguator or not, and statistics we've only known about the frequency of names in the last 20 years. Quite striking, isn't it? Because I know there are other things going on in that list, but for me, that says that list really comes from time and place. Let's look at the name John, which is the 5th most common name in Judea, Galilee, Israel, and Palestine. What happens there is, in Matthew's Gospel, Herod hears about Jesus and he says, that's John the Baptist, risen from the dead. Why does he say John the Baptist? Because he has to distinguish from other Johns. There are lots of Johns. He can't just say to his servants, you know, that's John, because they would say, which John do you mean? Now, then you have the way the narrator speaks. The narrator immediately afterward just talks about John or John, because if you're reading through the narrative, it's pretty clear which John we're talking about. But then when Herodias' daughter wants to have John's head, she can't just say, give me John's head. She might have got the head of the wrong John. So she says, give me the head of John the Baptist. and everyone else who's called John breathes a sigh of relief. But then immediately after the next verse, it's so he sent and beheaded John. So you see the narrator speaks one way, the characters in the narrative speak another way. This would be a great dissertation for you to look at, if you're looking to do a sort of study on the whole issue of the way people speak, what happens within speech marks in the Gospels and what's outside, because it affects names an awful lot. But what you see is that's the way people would have had to have spoken back then, otherwise they really would have been unclear. So either we've got reporting of the way people actually spoke, or we've got a really clever narrator. But the cleverer that you make the narrator, the harder it is to say they got it all wrong through bungling incompetence, which is what some people like to say. Let's look at the frequency of words in the Gospels. The most longest Gospel is Luke, and the shortest is Mark. Let's look at the frequency of the name Jesus in the Gospels. John has the most, Mark has the fewest, but he's the shortest. So if we do numbers of occurrence of the name Jesus over length, we get John having the most and Luke having the fewest. All I'm doing with those 3 slides is showing you that the 4 Gospels use the name Jesus in different frequencies. They use the name Jesus differently, because I'm now going to show you how they all use the name Jesus the same way. You see, what happens is, when Jesus is outside speech, usually you don't have a disambiguator. This is this case. They did just as Jesus had told them. But then we have the crowds need to disambiguate. Why? Because Jesus was a common name. There's Jesus called Justus. There's Jesus bar Jesus. You get in the New Testament. Jesus is just a variant of Joshua. So if in the New Testament times you said Jesus is coming down the street, the question would be, which Jesus? Now, of course, 100 years after Christianity's been going, Jesus is pretty famous. Then Jesus is unambiguous. But back in the Gospel times, that was not so. And the fact that the Gospels observe this early way of writing about Jesus, treating his name as ambiguous, is precisely a sign that the Gospels are early. You could look at the way the servant girl comes up to Peter and says, you were with Jesus the Galilean, and another servant girl with Jesus of Nazareth. That's in speech. But the surrounding occurrences, here and here, of the name Jesus are without disambiguator. So you see how people speak. It's also the way Pilate speaks in Matthew chapter 27. What shall I do with Jesus who's called the Christ? And so on. Even the angels like to disambiguate after the resurrection. You're looking for Jesus who was crucified. The same pattern can be found in Mark. So this has only been spotted in the last few years, and it works. You can go through Mark, you can go through Luke. Luke basically fits exactly the same pattern, with the one exception being the man on the cross, who of course is not in a crowd situation and therefore doesn't need to disambiguate. You go through John, and you have the same pattern, with one exception, which is the man born blind, when it's trying to illustrate that he's really only half knowing. And at that point, he says the man called Jesus, because he really doesn't know enough about Jesus. He's only halfway through his coming to realization. So whenever you get Jesus in a crowd situation, in speech, in the Gospels, he is disambiguated. Why would that happen if the Gospels were written much later?
I like this particular argument from Williams because it's relatively fresh. It's new information that we've only learned in the last 10 to 20 years. And so this is just like another layer of positive evidence for the reliability of the Gospels that we didn't really have before. And so I find that really fascinating. But I could imagine some of the pushback that I'm going to get from skeptics for publishing this video. They're going to say, well, Eric, come on. I mean, so what? They knew the names. What if historians and archaeologists 1,000 years from now or 2,000 years from now are digging up, ruins from New York City, and they really do find out that people were named Tony and Bruce and Peter Parker or something like that? Does that mean that the stories in the Avengers are all true? Or there's, Abraham Lincoln. He was a real historical person, but we know that he wasn't a vampire slayer. And so I get that pushback, but I don't think that's really the argument that Peter is making here. He's not saying that, well, they got the names right, therefore Jesus rose from the dead. It's a little more nuanced than that. But the first reason why I think that this particular objection is misguided is that these are not just easy facts to get right for people who are at that time. We think in our time, with the luxury of Google and Wikipedia, that this would be easy to just look up. But modern libraries weren't a thing back then, and obviously they had no internet. And so be careful saying, hey, you're committing the Spider-Man fallacy, Christians, when you, skeptics, are probably committing what I would call the Wikipedia fallacy. The other thing is that skeptics often say, well, Luke got something like, say, the census wrong, or Mark made this geographical error. Okay, now I think there are perfectly reasonable explanations that iron out some of the difficulties with those particular claims. But here's the thing. if you're saying that them getting facts incorrect counts as evidence against the Gospels, then you can't say, well, when they do get difficult facts right, that doesn't count as any evidence whatsoever. Evidence flows both ways, and so you can't just kind of have your cake and eat it too. The other thing is that the gospel writers stated their commitment to writing factual truth. You can read it in Luke's prologue. You can read it in John's gospel, where he says that he was an eyewitness, that he was testifying to what he had seen and heard. And then finally, the whole genre of modern realistic fiction wasn't something that existed for several hundred years later. So this isn't, Sherlock Holmes here. Yes, there really is a 221 Baker Street. No, it's not like that at all. Remember also that Williams is comparing the name data found in the 4 canonical gospels against the apocryphal gospels, like the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, and the Gospel of Thomas. And he's showing that when you are making up a story about Jesus that is legendary, that is long after the events from far, far away, you don't get these difficult facts correct. And so when you're comparing the whole fictional genre thing, even when we do have fictional stories about Jesus, we don't get the historical accuracy that we find in the Gospels. Finally, what about this whole idea that Christian apologists are saying that the gospel writers got a whole bunch of mundane facts correct, therefore Jesus rose from the dead? Well, that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that little clues in the documents like this shows us that the gospel writers were honest, that they were truthful, that they were close up to the facts, that they weren't writing from far, far away long after the events, that they didn't feel free to just make up stories. And so what they wrote down goes back to what the original eyewitnesses claimed. And what the original eyewitnesses claimed is that Jesus rose from the dead, flesh and bone, that he ate fish with them, that they saw him, they conversed with him in groups, and they made this claim to a hostile audience who had just crucified their Messiah. And so this is why this kind of data is important. So I hope you found this video helpful, and thank you so much for watching.